joining us on this first of 3 hours about the imagination. As I hope will become clear, I, but not me alone, feel that the imagination in a way is perhaps even the key human faculty for the recovery of meaning and the sense of the spiritual dimension and the divine in the modern world. I'll particularly say why that might be so in relation to Owen Barfield actually in the third session. But the first two are going to look at two other key figures in the modern period since the 17th century for the recovery of the imagination. And by that, the broad point is that the imagination, as Malcolm Guite puts it, as a truth-bearing faculty, that it doesn't just sort of add colour, isn't just about entertainment, but actually is a key capacity we have as human beings, which puts us in touch with reality, and particularly reality beyond the ins and outs of our own minds. Now, there's a lot more to say about it than that, of course, but that is the sort of the beginning and the end of it. And I think these three figures, each in their own way, that we're going to look at, Blake tonight, Carl Jung next week, and then Owen Barfield on the third week, had something to contribute to that, which together makes for quite a rich picture, I hope. That's not just sort of theoretical, not just inspirational, but is also quite practical, because all three of them were quite clear in their own way that this is something which everybody could become more involved with. So we've got the hour. I'm going to talk for a chunk of it, and I could talk for all of it, but I would like to give plenty of just do that. So I wanted to start with William Blake and literally start with some Blake and look at a couple of his images, because I think Blake, really his whole life, one way or another, although there were different phases of his life, one way or another was dedicated to trying to produce both poetry and imagery that could awaken the imagination in us once more, and particularly the imagination, what it can actually do. So let's look at two images and just start to get a sense of that, sort of warm up with a bit of Blake, if you like. So I hope that you can see this image. Wave your hand if you can only see me. You can't see a big image on the screen. That looks like it's working fine.
Yes, it's working fine.
Yep, thanks. So this is Blake's image called The House of Death. And have a good look at it. And I'll just sort of talk through a few points about it. At first glance, to me anyway, it clearly shows the suffering of there are five poor individuals. There's four lying down to the left, and then one tucked in the corner on the right there with his head or her head in her hands. It's called the House of Death because it's thought to have been a plague house in the 18th or 19th century when Blake lived. They lie on mats and they're curled up or racked in pain. And at their feet stands another male figure, muscular male figure. His head's bowed, his skin's grey, he holds a knife, if you can see that. And it's thought is the figure of despair. And his dagger that he's got in his hand there is the dart of death. And he kind of taunts the dying with it. He neither directly intimidates them with it, but neither does he just put it down. It looks like it's going to be used at some time. So this is a pretty grim scene that Blake has painted here. Maybe I should just say in parenthesis that Blake's images are always open to interpretation. This is one that I've got from reading around a few commentators and sources. But they say something like that. But then you look again and you see another presence that actually, when you focus on it, you realize is actually dominating the image. And this is the old man with a long white beard. And he's enthroned on clouds. If you look at the clouds, they're shaped like a throne. And between his outstretched arms, he's unrolled this long scroll. And if you look again at the scroll, you'll see that on each end are these vicious darts that are shooting out. And he looks like a divine figure. He looks like a patriarchal god. But he also looks very preoccupied with his own concerns. Although he's hovering right over the suffering individuals, he doesn't see them. And you might even say that he doesn't care to see them. His eyes are resolutely closed. Now, this is Blake, I think, painting with imagination and with vision. And his paintings have this very distinctive style. They're instantly recognizable because of that. And when he saw people suffering, he didn't just see misery and grief, which other painters in a more realistic or naturalistic mode would see as well. But he did see that, of course. He didn't also just want to make a moral point, I think, about, say, in this case, the links between poverty and pestilence, between the plague and presumed poverty of these individuals. Although that is there in the picture as well, and he's also well known for his remarks about the poverty of his time. But he sought to show really the workings of a whole system that's both spiritual and material. And in this case, what happens when it grimly grips a soul and a society in which that soul lives. So this picture is a worldview, as well as the scene of a plague house, the house of death. It's the image of a world that has come to be ruled by, what you might call a blind pretender god. This is the figure of Urizen that often figures in Blake's images. He painted him in many ways. And his presence creates a worldview that imagines life to be machine-like and material. The darts coming out of Urizen's scroll look quite mechanical. The dagger creates a mechanical air. And you're very conscious of kind of fleshly existence in this image. More broadly, Urizen, in this mode anyway, scorns anything that is not demonstrated by reason or empirical evidence. And I think that's why Urizen doesn't see the human life beneath him. Putting it in a slightly modern idiom, this is the approach to death that really only sees statistics. It doesn't actually see human suffering or human tragedy, let alone any meaning to death. And so I think you can sort of get a sense of that with this Urizen figure who doesn't see the individuals suffering beneath him. And it's an image of what Blake called single vision, by which he means that things are just seen through this one prism of materiality, without even much sense of vitality, let alone soulfulness. And it's deadly. So that's the first image. And I want to contrast it with the next image, which I hope you can see now. Has that popped up a new image? Can someone just wave to say that's happened? Yep, thanks very much. So this is the image of, actually I'll tell you what I'm just going to do it like this. Is that still all right? Yep. This is the image of the morning stars sang together, as it's called. And it makes a nice contrast because it too features 5 human individuals at the bottom of the picture there. And they're sitting in what looks like a cave, though they can also see through the ceiling. And they're looking up in wonder. And above them, again, is a cloud. And associated with that cloud is another bearded man. And he's a divine figure again, though interestingly, he looks quite similar to the man beneath him on the cave-like earth. His arms are outstretched as well, but his eyes are open, and he's looking towards distant horizons. Plus, he doesn't unscroll a scroll, but if you can see, he's sort of unleashing cosmic energy. And that's represented by what's underneath his arms, because under his right arm is Helios, the sun god, who keeps time, riding a golden chariot across the sky, if you can see that. And under his left arm is Helios' sister, Selene, the moon god. And she rides a silver chariot powered by serpents, which I think stands for all manner of experience in Blake's mythology. And then there's actual space above this divine figure as well. There's a third section that's in this one. And in it, angels dance with upstretched arms. And they're the morning stars that give the name to the picture, who delight, I think, in that part of reality, the upper quadrants, the upper third of reality in this picture, and has a very different quality. You see the stars there. And it's the quality of what Blake called eternity. And we see 4 of these angels, but the arms at the edge of the picture suggest that perhaps they continue on to infinity. They go on singing their songs to infinity. So this is from Blake's series, telling the story of Job, and it comes towards the end of the biblical story when God reveals God's awesome creativity to Job in the apocalyptic vision. And the words from that are inscribed. I'll read them out if you can't quite see them. It says, "Canst thou bind the sweet influence of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion?" is above the picture. And then below it says, "When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy." So this is Blake painting with imaginative vision again. And again, he doesn't just see individuals, in this case, Job and Job's companions, but also sees the bigger picture. But how bigger this picture is, how bigger this system is, how bigger this society of souls is now. It's not the workings of an oppressive system, but of dynamic creativity. And that signal, because around the margins of the picture, in fact, Blake has charted the scenes of creation in the biblical story, and from let there to be light to let the waters bring forth abundantly, in the roundels, if you can see them in the vertical margins of the picture. Now, it's very fascinating that the divine figure is the same as the human figure in look, and that's because the divine figure is the figure that Blake called Jesus, and I put it that way because Blake has quite a particular relationship with this figure, Jesus. He particularly is drawn to Jesus as the incarnation, the state of mind, if you like, that joins humanity and divinity, which is why Job looks like the divine. Jesus is not the savior of a fallen race now, so much as the life of imagination and exuberance, which the human side of us can look out of our cave in wonder and see the divine double, if you like, stretching out arms with energy and in touch, not just with the earth beneath, but eternity above. The figures gazing across the cosmos in wonder, gratitude, participating in life. The scene is a kind of kindling of active love, I think, which might amplify the life of all those concerned. The angels above know it already, and the figures beneath are starting to join in with it. The angels do what angels do, you know, they sing in jubilant song. But human life, interestingly, in the figure in the middle there, in Blake's depiction, this figure of the divine, Jesus, the imagination, where the finite life meets the infinite life, is the meeting place of heaven and earth. And I think that this is Blake saying human beings are asked to join the finite and material with the eternal and the spiritual in their souls and within society. And that this is what the imagination can achieve. I hope you can perhaps just see the first image alongside it now. I put that up just alongside. Can someone wave just to say that's the case? Yeah, great, thank you. So that, you know, just to have a kind of compare and contrast that. It's the opposite, really, of the house of death. In the house of death, Urizen resorts to a kind of blind force, which W.B. Yeats actually described as the will trying to do the work of the imagination, the will trying to do the work of the imagination. And it's a bleak state. It generates panic and mania, and if not quite death, then a kind of listless repetition and suffering. Whereas humanity in eternity, the second picture I showed there, the main picture now, has access to what Blake called joyful commingling with the whole of creation. And this is very much what he felt the imagination can achieve. It puts you in touch with the fullness of reality. That's why it's truth-bearing. As he puts it in another point, a fool sees not the same tree that a wise man sees. A fool sees not the same tree that a wise man sees. You don't even see the same God as those two pictures show. So I'll stop the image now, and we'll look at some more later, but I hope that gives us a sort of starting point, both to get our imaginations going, give us a taste of Blake, but also an indication of quite how far-reaching he thought the imagination can take us. It opens up eternity. It breaks down the barriers of the cave and enables us to share, to participate in cosmic life. So I thought I could just take a step back, really, and ask, why is it that we've got to this point where, in a way, what I'm trying to do is justify imagination? It's not quite an apology for imagination, because I want to say a lot more than just say, give it a go. But how come we've got to this place where imagination needs some kind of defense? But more positively, given that we're in that situation, and you know, when I say we, I mean our society at large, there may well be those of us, you know, you guys who know a lot more about it, maybe even than I do, practically. By that I mean not just theoretically. But you know, what might we learn afresh about the imagination, given where we find ourselves? Because, as Barfield put it, descents are always a chance for a new ascent. Nothing is lost, and that's another feature of the imagination, actually. It can always be creative with wherever it finds itself. So one of the starting points for this is that imagination, as we use it now, is actually a relatively recent deployment of the word. In the ancient world, say amongst the ancient Greeks, imagination literally meant receiving the imago. And many sort of understandings of optics in the ancient world conceived of objects giving off an imago, an image that we human beings in our bodies, one way or another, literally take in. So the imagination was just another word for to see, whereas instead of photons or waves, they imagined the imago being given off in various ways. And moreover, our eyes, in Aristotle's view at least, would emit a kind of light that enabled us to see the imago that we were receiving. It's not until the medieval world that the notion of imagination as just an inward activity starts to appear. It's still felt to have some contact with the outer world, but gradually becomes something which goes on just inwardly. And you could point to Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream for a line that captures that. You know, Shakespeare in the Renaissance period, really seminal in understanding in the modern way. And in the Midsummer Night's Dream, he has this famous line where he says, "The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact." By which he means that the lunatic, the lover, and the poet are similar in that all are using imagination. They're compact in imagination. But clearly the lunatic, the lover, and the poet are doing very, very different things with it. They all, Shakespeare carries on, say, apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends. So they apprehend, they take in something more than cool ever reason can comprehend. But then you get this question of what they're apprehending, because presumably the lunatic, the lover, and the poet apprehend things in very different ways. They're all things unknown, and they're all airy nothings to quote Shakespeare again. But this problem of discernment is raised. And, you know, Shakespeare is a good person to ask it. Someone who knew very, very intimately the power of the imagination, but also the need to discern and work the imagination in order to make something of it, which clearly he magnificently did. Now, in the birth of modern philosophy, say in the 17th, 18th century, a kind of idea was worked out about how the imagination works and how the discernment of the imagination works. And it puts it actually quite central to the theory of perception, how human beings perceive things. And basically, the imagination is that which gives shape to what would otherwise be a blooming, buzzing confusion, to use William James's expression, a blooming, buzzing confusion. You know, so if you think of looking at your image in a mirror or even on a screen, it takes imagination to recognize that that's not you, that it's some kind of representation of you, and to both know it's yourself, but also know it's not yourself. And that's something that the imagination can do. It helps us to discern reality. It's a very subtle business. I mean, mirrors are quite confusing, but if you think of a rainbow, how the imagination operates when we see a rainbow, it's even more fascinating because we all see the rainbow when we look into the sky and the sun is shining on one end of the sky and it's raining, and we look with our backs to the sun and see the rainbow coming through the droplets of the rain. We all see the prismatic effect of light coming through raindrops and so see the rainbow. But at the same time, we all know that the rainbow's not there, and that if we went to try and find its end, well, we wouldn't find its end, let alone a crock of gold. And yet we're all sharing the experience of seeing the rainbow. And that's part of the power, I think, of the collective imagination, not just the individual imagination. And if you did a history of rainbows, you could see that how rainbows were interpreted has varied quite substantially over time. And my guess is that that's because the collective imagination has interpreted rainbows in very different ways. So this idea of imagination giving shape to our perceptions is the broadly Kantian approach. And it's the dominant idea now. But it's often confined just to material reality. You know, so it's all very well to say that our imagination depicts the rainbow because we've got photons or light waves coming into our eyes. But anything that's not connected with some kind of physical sensing, the empirical world, falls into question. Is it real? Is it just fantasy? Is it just a product of the mind? Is it just an hallucination? And it took the Romantic movement that emerged about the same time as figures like Immanuel Kant. Particularly, I wanted to think about Coleridge, who knew Blake. They did meet at least once in about 1818. And Coleridge saw some of Blake's work and I think clearly recognized a kindred soul. And what Coleridge said was that the imagination is the creative act. Everything that has been created has been imagined. He thought that the primary imagination of creation is itself the mind of God. He writes this in his Biographia Literaria. So the primary imagination is creation itself, the mind of God. And the secondary imagination, as he puts it, is the imagination which we can share. And it's a sort of human echo of the divine creation. And so it gives life, it gives shape, it gives unity, it gives meaning, it gives connection to us in the continual creative acts that we're engaged with. You don't need to be any fancy artist to be a creative imaginer. You just have to talk, you just have to look, you just have to step outside, you just have to know someone. Your imagination is already fully active in this micro creations that connect with the macro creation and give it its life and vitality, its soulfulness. That's why it's alive. It's not just dead like Urizen might imagine. Now, we clearly also make mistakes. We can be fanciful, we can live in fantasy, we can go mad. What Coleridge said was that you can tell when imagination is true and real because it lasts and it expands us. It is productive. It generates more insights. So a really good example of this, I think, is from Albert Einstein, who famously thought of the theories of relativity by imagining what it was like to travel on a light wave, a light beam. Now, in one reading, that's just a kind of childish activity. But in another way, it led to, well, not just theories of relativity, but the overturning of the whole of physics. And so this was imagination because it was hugely productive, hugely creative, of a new way of engaging with the world. And so that is Einstein deploying imagination, not just fantasy. And then as Einstein put it, knowledge gets sort of drawn down from imagination. You turn it into some maths so you can do something with it, for example. So that's broadly the distinction that Coleridge introduced into the discussion. And I think it's one that really stands up and is a very good one. Now, I might just pause there and before I come to my sort of third section and return to Blake and think a little bit more about Blake's imaginative states of mind. He has a whole kind of schema, which is what I wanted to offer, because I think it helps us to navigate our way through different kinds of imagination. But I might just pause there because just to make sure that this is still working for everybody, but also because there might be one or two questions that help clarify things from what I've said so far that would be useful at this point. We gradually solve that puzzle. Our sense of the imagination and what it can see and do expands. So, you know, you can read his poetry and often instantly get something out of it. You know, like the wise man and the fool don't see the same tree. And, you know, there's lots of quotes of Blake's that have made it into the popular imagination. But particularly his epic poems and his more complex imagery. He does ask you to work at it because it's in the working that your imagination is trained and discerned, and you can step through one-fold, two-fold, three-fold to four-fold vision. So what I thought I could do now is just sort of describe these 4 steps and hopefully give you a sense of how this does happen to us sort of all day, every day. And so the task is really one of using his schema to notice what state of imagination we're in, so that we can gradually cultivate and be freer to move across different states of imagination. And as it were, not just see the guinea sun rising in the morning, but see the heavenly hosts. So the first state, which, you know, someone I've alluded to in that first picture, the House of Death, with Urizen, is he called it the state of Ulro, which is U-L-R-O. And if you want a kind of a strapline for Ulro, it's the state that loves reason, hence the god Urizen presiding over it. It believes the world reality is engaged by measuring things, for example, or it trusts abstractions like laws of nature or generalizations. It feels that rules are probably the truest thing. It trusts statistics as well. You know, if you were going to have an Ulro type education, it's really about how just to pass the exams with the greatest percentage. It's, you know, as mechanical as possible just to kind of get you through the exam. And similarly, wisdom really is based on calculations and good evidence. So someone in an Ulro state of mind, when you ask them, you know, what's the correct answer, they say, you know, let's get more evidence. Or let's make a better calculation. It's that kind of approach. Now, this isn't automatically a bad thing. For Blake, Ulro can be a very helpful state of mind to be in. So for example, if you go into a panic, then you're quite likely to regress to an Ulro state because it promises quite a lot of safety. And I think that in the COVID pandemic, you could say, there's been a lot of Ulro around, turning to statistics, we want to know the rules, you know, are we supposed to wear a mask or not? We want more evidence to be gathered so we know the truth of COVID-19. And there's clearly a lot in that. But Blake's critique always is that it's not that one state is necessarily bad in itself, but what is bad is getting stuck in single vision and Newton's sleep. That's why it puts you to sleep if you get stuck in single vision. And in particular, it doesn't even know that it's using the imagination to generate its abstractions and generalizations and laws. It thinks imagination is deluded and fantastical. So it's not very self-aware, this Ulro state. It doesn't really know what to do with things like suffering or death. You know, they're best avoided, really. And again, in the COVID crisis, you've seen that with, you know, flatten the curve. That's this dominant desire just to reduce the numbers of people who are dying. And look, clearly there's something in that, but there must be more to suffering and death for we human beings. And Ulro can't really access that. It's just bewildered if you ask what death means. Freedom's really about control. The more control you have, the freer Ulro would say you are. Life is sort of machine-like in Ulro. And again, you know, if you're having a heart valve operation, you probably want quite a lot of Ulro to be around. But if you view your heart just as a machine, then clearly you're going to lose out on more in life as well. So let me just show this one image again, which is one of his most famous depictions of Ulro. I hope you can see that now. This is Newton in Newton's sleep, measuring the world. His compasses there, they limit things as much as they measure things. You know, Newton can only, as it were, see between the 2 points of his compass there. He can't see the world around him, and the world around him therefore has sort of almost disappeared in a kind of gloomy, it looks like he's at the bottom of the sea. The darkness is the rest of reality. And it looks like a, well, there is life there, but it's kind of spooky life. He can't really make much sense of it, even if he could see it. So that's one of Blake's famous images of this Ulro state, single vision and Newton's sleep. So now let's come to the second state. This is the state of generation. Now, if Ulro had loved reason, generation loves reproduction. I think you can summarize it like that. And again, there's good and bad in this. The good is that it can see there's such a thing as life, and that life must reproduce to go on. There's more when there's more life, you might say. But the risk is that that reproduction descends into mindless replication. And sometimes I think you see the ambiguity of generation if you go into a supermarket, because on the one hand, it's a joy to see lots of different kinds of food. And you know, you think of what it's taken to reproduce that food. But then you go down the cereals aisle and you realize that there's just dozens of different kinds of cereal for no real reason other than just brand extension. And that's reproduction, I think, descending into mere replication. And, you know, our consumer culture is full of that ambiguity now. There's a joy in all that we can enjoy in life, but there's something a bit degenerate about it as well, which maybe you often feel. So this mix goes on throughout this state of generation. You know, it trusts longevity, it trusts health. It would say you've got to keep fit, but it talks about those things mostly in terms of just surviving, extending life, and doesn't really have much a sense of quality of life. It finds that hard to talk about. Quantity of life is really what counts. Education, you might say, has moved on a bit. It would enjoy problem solving. It can apply principles rather than just generalizations and abstract laws. But it's a bit clever at the same time. There's a, you know, if you see someone who's wise in generation, you might think they're smart, but they don't really seem to speak much from the heart. And after a while, it starts to feel a bit empty. You know, they might talk about prisoners' dilemmas in ethics, or talk about the world as a zero-sum game. And it's something in it, but, you know, you feel it's not quite getting to the grips with things somehow as well. I think that generation does know that it has imagination. But imagination is more about persuading or manipulating, sort of wooing you. You know, so marketeers have this kind of imagination, and they want to sort of seduce you with their products by building up their brands through imagination. So they can be very good at that. It can be, in a way, very imaginative, but imagination itself is constrained, and so it doesn't have the full lease of life that you're going to find in threefold and fourfold vision. Suffering and death are seen a bit differently in generation. They're not just bewildering to be avoided if possible. They're now seen as sort of travesties that ideally will be remedied. And so in generation, medicine, particularly biological-based medicine, really takes off because it recognizes that suffering and death are travesties, and so it will use its imagination to try and remedy that. Blake also called this state the vegetative state, vegetation. If you ever read the word vegetation in Blake, he's talking about generation, because with no disrespect to the plants and trees, he saw this as a bit like the ivy, perhaps, that unchecked just kind of keeps growing over everything and will, you know, tear down even your concrete building given half a chance. So there's something a bit Triffid-like about generation left unchecked. But it's also about life. It is about life, and it is about reproduction. And the figure in Blake's poetry who you often see caught in a state of generation is this chap, who I hope you can see now. This is loss. And loss here is shown in two forms, actually. He's shown with the naked full frontal view, and then also with his rear view, carrying the sun, carrying the light. This shows the two sides of reproduction or generation. There is the one side that can carry the light into the world, but there's also the other side that gets a bit obsessed just with making stuff. So Loss has his hammer and he has his compass there. He's often in his fiery furnaces making things. He forges Golgonooza in generation, and it's not a worthless activity, but actually in Eden-Eternity, Golgonooza doesn't exist. It's like Loss learns something from making Golgonooza, and that learning can be carried into higher states of imagination, but Golgonooza itself doesn't make it there. The female figure on the right there is Loss's lover or emanation, Enitharmon. And in generation, there is love, and there's joining together, but it's for the purposes of reproduction. So they're on sort of opposite sides of the screen, and Blake's very neatly done it so the sun's on one side and the moon's on the other. So there's a kind of contrary that's in some sort of balance, but they're not commingling. That will happen in a higher state of imagination. And just if you're wondering, the kind of Stonehenge looking like structures, Blake thought that these megaliths were built by druids, as was the wisdom of the time. What's changed now is he was rather down on druids. He thought that druids indulged in human sacrifice. So normally when you see druids, they represent a kind of lesser state of consciousness before self-sacrifice really comes in. You sacrifice someone else in druidic religion, according to Blake. And so that's why the Stonehenge is in this kind of lower state. It's not worthless at all, and it's impressive in its own way, but it hasn't achieved threefold or fourfold vision. It's in this twofold state. So now if I come to the threefold vision, and this is the vision he called Beulah, which is B-E-U-L-A. It comes from the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, where Isaiah, I think it says, and the land will be called Beulah. And it means it's wedded to the Lord. It's kind of in covenantal relationship, in loving relationship with God. And so this third state, it's not about reason, it's not about reproduction, it's about relationships. And in Beulah, there's safety in love, the safety in support, being understood, empathy, feelings, vulnerability. This is what this imaginative state enables. It enables you to see that there's another person who isn't just part of the working world, but has a soul, has life. It's when I-it relationships turn into I-thou relationships, to use Martin Buber's phrase. It trusts values, it knows the soulfulness, it knows that there's interior life as well as exterior life. You know, education is about emotional intelligence, about nuance, about art appreciation. Wisdom is a kind of expressiveness. It loves the detail. It knows it has imagination, of course. I mean, Generation knew it had imagination, but Beulah knows that imagination isn't just about reproduction, but it's actually about creativity. That the imagination can not just replicate stuff, but can make things that are new, and can share in a higher creativity even. Suffering and death come to be viewed not just as travesties to be avoided, but tragedies that in themselves teach you something about the nature of mortal life. You know, tragedy will move us, both in terms of saddening us, but also making us value life. And so Beulah understands the tragedy of love and life. It's a blissful state as well. Blake thought that Beulah always exists. We can sort of draw on it. We can regress to it, if you like. We can relax in it. You know, maybe a good night's sleep is like Beulah. And let me just show a couple of images that I hope say that in more visual form. Here's one image that I think captures something of Beulah. It's Blake's image that's normally called friendship. And you can just see the kind of fellow feeling there and the interest in life and the world. You know, the city has got these rays of vitality coming out of it. The path they're following looks like a flowing river. You know, they're co-mingling, they're in their shared experience there, these friends, as they together look on. There's a lot of lovely life in this image. And here's another image of Beulah that I particularly love because it comes from the Purgatory. Blake did a series of these images where here Dante and Virgil are climbing up the stairs at the side of Mount Purgatory. And they have these kind of resting places where they see across the vast expanse of the sea, and they see the sun. They have hope, and they know they're on a journey and it's meaningful. And there's intimacy between Virgil and Dante always. And I think that's a very Beulah state. There are other states that Dante comes across on Purgatory. It can be a very terrifying place as well. But there's these Beulah states that they can return to and find refreshment. So that's a third state, which, you know, we all experience, and it's good to be able to distinguish it and realize that it's just one of at least four. It's not one to try and live in for too long, because Blake also felt that love can go wrong. You know, it can flip and turn to hate. It can become envious. It can become moralistic. And I think that that's another thing which we see quite a lot of now, that social media, which in one way is a chance to connect, is the chance to show friendship. When it becomes an end in itself and doesn't have fourfold vision, it's a bit stuck in threefold vision, there's always the risk that it turns and so becomes, you know, aggressive, becomes attacking. You know, it's quite easy to make friends when you have a common enemy. Of itself, Beulah is not enough. And that's why Blake, I think, had the idea of fourfold vision. And he called fourfold vision Eden or eternity, or sometimes Eden-Eternity. And, you know, if Ulro had loved reason, and Generation had loved reproduction, and Beulah had loved love, then Eden-Eternity loves life itself in all its manifestations. It has, as it were, the capacity to absorb everything, all the contraries, and because of its powerful imagination, to always be able to transcend whatever life throws at us. So this is the fullness of sight and perception. It's multidimensional. It's able to move across other states of mind. It completely trusts the imagination. It knows that it is the creative source of reality. It knows that it defends what has been and will make what will be. In this state, education is about personal development. It's about using the imagination to make contact with reality as fully as possible. It fosters a wisdom that's based on insight, which is both practical know-how. You know, remember Blake was an engraver. He had tremendous amounts of practical know-how. It's also about your virtues and your character skills, you might say, the kind of person you are. And because if imagination asks you to see that reality is good, beautiful, and true at base, you need to be good, beautiful, and true to some extent in order to resonate with that, so your imagination can pick it up. But imagination is also a pathway to new worlds, you might say. It takes you out of your mind into the world around us, but even takes us into other worlds, like particularly the divine world. You know, hence that image of Job seeing his divine aspect, and then also right into the heavens. So suffering and death now becomes transformative, because in Eden-Eternity, you can see that there's a timelessness to reality, and that life holds death. It's not that life is a kind of random, fleeting moment out of eternal death, but rather death is a transitional moment in life, and in particular might well be a transition that takes you from lower to higher states of mind. It's able to kiss the joy as it flies. Do you remember that wonderful quatrain of Blake's? He who binds to himself a joy does the winged life destroy. That would be Ulro, binding himself to the joy. But he who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. That's what Eden-Eternity imagination can do. It doesn't need to possess, because it always knows there's more, and that's the more that it can see. Ultimately, you know, it's about life that knows divine life. And so let me just show a final image that I hope captures something of this final state. I hope you can see that one there now. You know, this is the kind of image you might expect. It's called Heaven's Portals Opened, I think. And it's, you know, it's the human soul ascending joyously into the heavens through the Gothic arches with the angels there. And it's just full of vitality and sweep. More subtly, I think this is also an image of Eden-Eternity. This is one of Blake's representations of Naomi and Ruth, the Old Testament story again. And this is when Naomi tells Ruth to go back to her own country. But Ruth says, no, I will stay with you now. And Blake thought that one of the key ways that we enter Eden-Eternity is by what he called, rather dramatically, self-annihilation. And by what that he meant, in a way, was, it wasn't quite denying the ego. Again, as I sort of mentioned at the beginning, I'm a bit suspicious of that way of putting it, because I think we're invited to be fully conscious in this state as much as in any other state. And not just invited, that's an essential part of the state. You know, we're invited to see our own divine nature. I'm liking the image from the book of Job there. But nonetheless, we're invited to continually sacrifice that awareness to a larger awareness, to others, so that it becomes a sort of springboard or a wellspring of ever wider vision, rather than limiting and constraining us like a pair of compasses. And I think that Blake's painted this moment between Ruth and Naomi, where Ruth says, no, I'm staying, because you see Ruth's sacrifice leading to their wider life together, that was going to enable. So it's a wonderful moment where that Ruth's, as it were, self-annihilation actually steps into a wider life. And of course, it's the trope of death leading to life that is so central to Christianity and other wisdom traditions as well. So the Eden-Eternity is dynamic, and it really asks something tremendous of us as well. But in Eden-Eternity, you have the imagination to know that this sacrifice always leads to more, and so you welcome it. It's not just a moral imperative. It's not certainly not something to be avoided. You start to see it as the path of life itself. So there's something about Ulro, generation, Beulah and Eden-Eternity. And I presented it like that because I hope that it almost provides a kind of map through these different imaginative states. And rather than thinking, I must get Eden-Eternity now, I think the way to do it is much more to just to start to notice what state of mind you're in, and know that what Blake really aims is fluidity and change across these different states of mind. You know, Urizen, if you remember the blind god at the beginning, actually Urizen is in Eden-Eternity. But in Eden-Eternity, Urizen knows that reason serves discernment. It serves a bigger picture. It serves the imagination. And so then Urizen opens his eyes and shares in the joy. So, you know, Ulro and the lower states have their place, but when they know their place in relation to the higher states, then they become part of our freedom and not that which traps us.